Hi, my name is Dale Bruning, and I'm part of the continuation of this instruction video with regard to jazz guitar. We've already perhaps seen, most of us, the first three segments of that where we've dealt with technique on the instrument, and then one where we were concentrating on melody, and then another one on harmony. Here in this fourth segment, sometimes like to divide things up with repertoire and some theoretical considerations. Also, and perhaps maybe most importantly in this fourth one, improvisation. But before demonstrating anything, let's just talk briefly about repertoire and theoretical background, and then maybe we can reach a point to talk about doing some improvisation. First of all, with repertoire, as the years have gone by, jazz musicians have added a lot of things to their jazz repertoire, but still the standards that have been written by the Tin Pan Alley composers, as we sometimes say, they're still a large part of the repertoire. And I'm talking about the songs written by people like George Gershwin and Cole Porter and Jerome Kern and Harold Arlen. But then other songs that have become very much a standard for the repertoire are those songs written by jazz musicians themselves. Certainly we appreciate things that have been written by Charlie Parker, by Dizzy Gillespie, by John Lewis, and then more recently, as time has gone by, John Coltrane and perhaps Wayne Shorter and Herbie Hancock and so on. But some of the songs of Duke Ellington, who was certainly a significant figure in the history of the music, certainly his songs ought to be something that you would consider in including songs in your repertoire. But then here are things to think about. Sometimes your repertoire, if you're playing with some other group, maybe your repertoire is largely what the band leader that you're working for, the leader of the group, the songs that are mainstays for his repertoire. So your obligation is obviously to learn those songs in order to be professional and accommodating. But I think each of us ought to think about our own repertoire, which would be made up of some of our most favorite things. And so they should include ballads, then various songs that could be labeled as swing at moderate tempos, even slow tempos, moderate tempos, and faster tempos for sure. They ought to include things in 3/4 time signatures and 6/8. Sometimes we ought to make sure that our repertoire includes things that are basically blues, whether 12-bar blues or 16-bar blues or blues with a bridge or major blues, minor blues. But blues are still a very large part of our repertoire, so that should be part of it. And then, of course, there have been a lot of contrafact melodies, that is, melodies based on the chord changes and the form of George Gershwin's I Got Rhythm. in most cases we just refer to that as rhythm changes, but we ought to learn some of those lines, bebopish if you will. But then, in addition to those things, sometimes we can include perhaps some things in our repertoire that come from the folk song idiom, and that could be very wide and varied. There have sometimes been some folk songs that are very much a part of the United States, but sometimes some European countries. I know there's been recordings with some Swedish folk songs and so on. But anyway, that's another area. And then, not to be neglected would certainly be some things that we would just label as classical music. Sometimes some things by Bach have been included in one way or another in the jazz repertoire. As guitarists, we know sometimes things that have been written for the classical guitar have lent themselves for the jazz repertoire. As an example, the Joaquin Rodrigo's Concerto de Juan Hues, the Adagio movement of that has been played by different jazz musicians, not just guitarists. So anyway, those are things that a person ought to think about with regard to the repertoire. But I mean, if you had a list of 60 songs, it'd be pretty hard to be trying to take in all of that all at once. So my recommendation is perhaps getting at least one song in these different categories and really working hard on those songs so that you at least have got a good start in each of those areas, like ballads and 3/4. Oh, and one thing I neglected to mention also, we need to have Latin things, you know. Sometimes we can just refer to them as Latin music, or sometimes we might hear the Latin things, some things by Dizzy Gillespie that are Afro-Cuban, but in these since about late 50s on into the 60s, the music from Brazil, the bossa nova things, we certainly ought to include some of those. It would be expected of us, and our fellow musicians would expect that we would know some things by Antonio Carlos Jobim or Luis Bonfa, some of those wonderful Brazilian composers. So anyway, going back to working on those things, try to choose something in each of those categories, but work on them well. If you decided, well, I'm going to learn Body and Soul for a ballad, well, learn it and learn it well. If you're going to learn some bebop sort of a figure like Charlie Parker's Blues for Alice or something, well, learn that very well. Learn the melody, learn the chord changes and so on. And incidentally, with regard to any of those, I have a suggestion that could be made to learning some of those melodies. To learn them on your instrument, in this case obviously with the guitar, you learn that melody very well and memorize it, know it by heart to be sure, and then if you would, learn to sing along with it. Now, we're not trying to become professional singers, but if you sing that melody along with your playing, there's some benefits that come from that, because after being able to hum that melody, then you might be able to play a bass line and listen to how the bass line fits with that melody. And then from a bass line, you might move on to shell chords, that is, where you're playing mostly thirds and sevenths of the harmonies that you're going to use with that song. So again, start with just learning the melody well, because it'll always be a reliable reference later on when you're attempting to improvise, to be sure. And then after learning the melody and even singing with it accurately enough so that you can compare your bass line with what what the melody of the song is that you're singing, and then on to shell chords, and then from there maybe to a more elaborate sort of a harmonic accompaniment to the melody. But long before you would think about improvising, make sure that you can play the melody itself very well. And there are, and I'm not trying to be so judgmental in this, but there's some jazz musicians who it would seem as if when they're playing the melody, they're just treading water until they finally get to their solo. That's when the music really starts to happen. But if you listen to some outstanding jazz improvisers, you're just thrilled with hearing you just play the melody itself. And so that's where it starts. And then, of course, if you're playing a harmonic instrument like the guitar or the piano or the vibes or whatever, you certainly want to be able to go to the harmonies and play that well. And this doesn't have to do so much with improvisation as yet. It just has to do with being able to play the song well. So those are some things with regard to repertoire that I would suggest. Let's move on to talking just a little bit about the theoretical background. Any song that you decide to play, you need to make a very thorough study of that song and understand the form. You know, is it, so many songs are 32 bars long. Is it A-A-B-A or is it A-B-A-C? Does it have a bridge or doesn't it have a bridge? Certainly just from a theoretical standpoint, knowing the form of the song, to be sure. And then, of course, starting with many people will start, when they think about the tools of improvisation, they'll start with scales. And it is true, as long as we have been improvising, three of the main tools for improvisation are scales, arpeggios, and intervals. Intervals that are based upon the scale or intervals that are associated with the arpeggio itself. So, if we're going to be able to use scales effectively, we have to be able to understand functional harmony in order to be able to make the right choices with scales. Sometimes if, for example, you said, well, okay, the chord is D minor 7th, what scale do I play with it? Oh, well, you play the D Dorian mode. Incidentally, part of your theoretical background should be learning, when it comes to scales, those Greek modes, to be sure, learning symmetrical scales, bebop scales, blues scales. Those are the things that are just necessary tools in improvisation. But anyway, if someone said, well, play the Dorian mode with the D minor 7th, the problem is if you don't know how that D minor 7th is functioning in the progression, your scale choice might be in error. So first learn how that D minor 7th is functioning. If it's the 2 minor 7 chord in the progression, then the D Dorian mode would certainly be the correct choice. But on the other hand, supposing the D minor 7th is the 3 minor 7 chord in the key of B flat, well, now more than likely you're going to be playing the Phrygian mode, so a D Phrygian would be what might be the appropriate scale to play. But then maybe you're playing D minor 7th as a 6th chord in the key of F. Well, F major, then now it's a D aeolian. So you get the point. You must know how the chord that you're going to play that scale with functions. And if you know that relationship, the functional harmony, then you can make wise decisions for scale choices. So again, when you're trying to prepare yourself theoretically, learn as much as you can about the form. Obviously, you need to know about the key signatures and the time signatures, those basic things. But learning, as I'm saying, the form, and then learning functional harmony, after that, being able to make wise choices for scales. However, one big advantage with regard to scale choices is that in many instances, especially with dominant 7th chords, you can make more than one choice, and sometimes your choice might depend upon how consonant or dissonant you want that scale to sound, because sometimes symmetrical scales that can be played, like whole tone scales or diminished scales that can be played with dominant 7th chords, would certainly create a little bit more tension than if you played just a plain, say, Mixolydian mode with a dominant 7th, or maybe the 5th mode of a harmonic minor scale with a dominant 7th. The Mixolydian or the 5th mode harmonic minor would sound a little bit more foundational and ground flourish, which is okay. On the other hand, those symmetrical scales, like a whole tone scale or a diminished scale, would certainly create more tension. So it might depend upon what it is that your needs are, for sure. But then, moving along to arpeggios, the one difference with regard to learning arpeggios than the scales, if you learn that D minor 7, D, F, A, C, doesn't matter what key you're in, the notes of a D minor 7th are D, F, A, C. And so as you learn arpeggios, you know if you decide to use the arpeggio in your improvisation, you're on solid ground with playing the notes of that arpeggio, whereas sometimes if you're trying to play a scale with that arpeggio or with that chord, and you choose the wrong scale, well, you could be bumping into troubles, so to speak. So, learning functional harmony so that you make wise choices for scales, and also learning how to use symmetrical scales, etc., blues scales, pentatonic scales, learning how to use those, but then learning arpeggios so that you can get the maximum mileage out of arpeggios. And with regard to arpeggios, sometimes what you need to learn perhaps in a given key are just the basic triad arpeggios. I've probably done this when we were talking about arpeggios earlier, but if I just play in the key of C, we need to start with that and then learn, obviously, to be adding sevenths with different distributions. So those are things that are just basic and essential, but then as time goes on, you'll learn more about the upper partials of arpeggios. By that I'm talking about maybe the 9th, the 11th, and the 13th, sometimes even 15th of the chords. My mentor, Dennis Sandoli, would certainly include 15ths when we talked about the upper partials of chords. But sometimes you can, and this is where triad arpeggios can be useful to you. If I were playing, say, a C major 7th, and I played the 7th, C, E, G, B, and then I wanted to play the 9th, the augmented 11th, and the 13th, that would be a D major triad. So if I play just those 3 notes, I'm playing the 9th, the augmented 11th, and the 13th of that chord. But if I play them all together, then you might say, well, okay, I'm playing C major 13th, augmented 11th. Another way where the triad arpeggio might be very handy would be to say, well, if I just start with a basic C chord and play C, E, G, then to play the 7th and 9th, the augmented 11th, and the 13th, I could play a B minor 7th arpeggio. So here's a C triad arpeggio, and then a B minor 7th arpeggio. So those are options that you sometimes can exercise. I'll just do it again, say with the C 7th chord. If I played C, E, G, B flat, and then I wanted to play the 9th, augmented 11th, to 13th, I'd again play a D major triad. On the other hand, if I played the C 7th arpeggio, or rather just the C triad arpeggio, C, E, G, then from this point I would be playing a B flat major 7 plus 5 arpeggio, B flat, D, F sharp, A. So a B flat major 7th plus 5 So those are different usages of the triad arpeggios. So they don't, the triad arpeggios are obviously useful for a foundation, but they're very helpful in thinking about the upper partials of chords. One more point about this. Supposing I wanted to play in a sequential way, the notes of a C major 13th augmented 11th, I could start with a C major arpeggio, and then an E minor arpeggio, then a G major arpeggio, and then a B minor, and then a D major. So notice again, I played a major triad, C major, then E minor, E, G, B, G major, G, B, D, B minor, B, D, F sharp, D major, D, F sharp. So I played nothing but triad arpeggios, but the result of it was that I was actually playing a C major 13th augmented 11th. So again, just the emphasis on the value of learning triad arpeggios, and then of course 7th arpeggios, and sometimes it's good to learn them maybe in 1 octave or 2 octaves or even 3 octaves. You can sometimes play, like, say, a G major 7th. So I just played that. So in some instances when you're improvising, depending upon the tempo and the harmonic rhythm, that might be useful. In other instances, maybe where you redistribute the notes, like what I was just doing a second ago, there was 2 notes per string, G, B, and then D, F sharp, and then repeating G, B, D, F sharp, G, B, D, F sharp. But sometimes maybe you only need to play 2 octaves of it, and I could play it like so. So that'd be 2 octaves of a G major 7. So, Or maybe in other instances, just the one octave. But we certainly need to learn triad arpeggios and seventh arpeggios as sort of the foundation from a theoretical standpoint. So we've talked a little bit about scales, a little bit about arpeggios. What about intervals? Well, the intervals based on scales can be the usual things that we would think about, playing thirds, simple intervals, and maybe not so much compound intervals, but just simple intervals like playing seconds. Or maybe just playing thirds. Or perhaps you might be playing fourths. And so on. So, why would they be important? Well, certainly, we don't want to always be playing stepwise as you do in a scale, or even when you're playing an arpeggio, you're playing stacked thirds most of the time. When you're able to play the different intervals of a scale, it certainly creates other sounds. If I'm in the key of C and I play, playing sevenths, and that creates certainly a different sound. And so in many instances, good melodies are a mixture of stepwise passages along with wider intervals, to be sure. Now, that's everything I was doing there was based upon the scale. But on the other hand, supposing I played some intervals that were based upon the arpeggio, and this is what I mean. I might play thirds that are based upon the arpeggio, C to E, E to G, G to B, B to D, D to F sharp to A. So I was playing thirds, and in the process, I was basing the playing of those thirds on that C major 13th arpeggio. And sometimes you can play what might be fifths, and so on. So you're playing intervals, but as you think about them, whether they're thirds or fifths or whatever, they're intervals that come from the arpeggio. So those things are some foundational exercises that would certainly be helpful in the interest of trying to be effective with your improvisations. So strong theoretical background doesn't mean that we can't sometimes be intuitive and, so to speak, play by the seat of our pants. There's nothing wrong with that in doing it. But the more you know about your material, the more options you have, and the more effective you're going to be, and the less likely you're just going to be repetitive and play the same old favorite licks again and again. If your theoretical foundation is strong, and you have an approach where you feel as if you're going to keep adding these theoretical nuggets to your grab bag of things to play. Because as time goes on and you listen to the best of players, you can hear maybe a recording of them at a certain point, and then you listen to that same person, a recording 20 years later, and you can hear the wonderful development that's occurred. Well, part of that improvement that you're hearing from that instrumentalist has to do with his learning more about the nuts and bolts of music, to be sure. So that's why we should continue to do that. Now, we can spend just a little bit of time here, perhaps, talking about improvisation itself on a tune, and I have in the first volume of a book that I wrote on phrasing and articulation, in the back of the book there's a little song that isn't some song to be etched in stone or anything. It was a song to just sort of demonstrate some scale and arpeggio things, but we can use it here to demonstrate a little bit about improvisation, and I'll just play it easily for you. There's more to the song than what I just played, but just those 8 measures or 16 measures we'll kind of use as an example of thinking about some improvisation. Again, to repeat the point I was making before, maybe I didn't play the melody too well, but I'll play that melody again. That's the first step along the line. As far as I want to go, there is a bridge to the song, but I just wanted to use those first 16 bars. So that's the melody, and as we look at the song itself, the chord changes are E minor 7, 3, 4, A 7, 3, 4, 2, so a little cycle of fourths. 3, 4, 2, 3, 4. Then it'll turn around. 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Then back. And that's where we stop. So, if we, according to what I was suggesting before, if we learned about our tools, about scales, about intervals, scales, arpeggios, and intervals, let's start with the scale, because the song itself is basically based upon just portions of scales. But here's the thing, supposing now we want to improvise, and the first scale that we would play with that E minor 7 flat 5, because it's the 3 minor 7 altered 3 minor 7 chord of the key of C, which I'm in, and so the E minor 7 flat 5's appropriate scale there would be the E Locrian, to use those Greek terms. With the A7th, and it has a flat 9 in it, I might play a 5th mode harmonic minor. The D minor 7 flat 5, I'd probably be playing the D Locrian, and with the G7 flat 9 you could play either the 5th mode harmonic minor for consistency and being imitative in one scale after another, or since you're in the key of C and the G7 flat 9 is really coming out of the harmonic major tonal center, well, you could use the fifth mode of a harmonic major scale starting on G there. So here's my point. So I'll play those scales. I won't play them with a swing inflection, I'll just play the notes simply. And then the fifth mode harmonic minor starting from A. Then the fifth mode, the D Locrian scale. And then, now this, in this case, I'll play the fifth mode of the harmonic major scale. And then, of course, just the major scale itself. So, here are things that could be done in a very simple way, and I'm going to keep time. Oh, some extremely important things about improvisation. We may not be able to discuss that in this segment, but it might have to do with the interaction with your fellow musicians, the length of your solo, the style of your solo, the way in which you interact with the rhythm section, the volume level that you may want to play on, and whether you're truly playing by yourself or perhaps you're interacting two solos at the same time with another, your fellow musician on the bandstand. There are all kinds of things that we could talk about, but I'm just talking today here just about some fundamental things about adding notes from the scale to your improvisation. So I'm going to just start by playing the first two notes of that E Locrian scale, but keep time. So 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4. Then to turn around. 3, 4, 1, 3, 4. So, that might not sound like much, but that could be a start, just playing those two notes of the scale. You don't have to play the entire scale every time you improvise. But now, having done that, let's say you add a note and you play the first three notes to that. So again, about that same tempo, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, excuse me. I might play just 3/8 notes, or I might change the rhythm. Because that's an option that you always have. You could always change the rhythm, you know, as far as note values are concerned. But I'll just play those first three notes of the scale each time now. 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that gave me three notes as I was playing. Of course, what's going on in the background while you're playing that? So I can't play both of those at the same time, but you have to keep in mind that that's the basis for those scale tones that I was playing. So now, the next note we might add would not be the fourth note of the scale, because if the fourth note of the scale is a perfect fourth above the starting note, the impression or the perception that you get is that the tonal center and the root of the chord is not the starting note, but the note that you end with. For example, if I went If I did that, then you'd say, well, okay, that sounds more like it belongs to A than E. So, an easy solution to that is to just play 1, 2, 3, 5. So, I'll play through 2, 3, 4. So the pattern I just played, 1, 2, 3, 5, has become a famous pattern to play because of John Coltrane and his using those. Well, at least we've gotten off to a start here today, so there's some things to be thought about with regard to our repertoire and our theoretical foundation and the improvising itself. So we'll certainly look forward to adding what's there. So look for you the next time. Thank you for listening. 2, 3, 4.
Thank you.